Samuel J. Withers was a tall, thin, cold-looking man of middle age, with a pair of thin, cruel lips and narrow eyes, the colour of skimmed milk. His hair was thin, and his hands were thin, and folks said he had a thin soul, but a wonderful knack at making money and keeping it. His physician had ordered him to take a rest from his labours, and on the advice of some Topeka club friends, he had decided upon a brief season of bird shooting in the western part of the state. He walked along the platform with impatient strides, his mind far from his surroundings. It chanced that Bill lay directly in his path. As the old dog slumbered in the sunlight, he dreamed, as dogs will do. He dreamed, doubtless, of the open places of hard marches across the bitter stubble in the white frosts of the morning, of swift sallies through dried and matted grasses, in and out of hedges, and up a long silver lane that was the river, of sudden blinding flurries of feathered things which shed a warm odour that was as perfume to his senses. Then suddenly he leapt to his unsteady legs, barked gutturally, only to gaze about him with a sheepish expression, and he discovered that somnambulance had made a fool of him, for Bill was a dog of great reserve and much dignity. Mr. Withers was right upon Bill when the old pointer came to life, and the financier was startled for the first time in many years. It made him furious. Apparently he construed Bill's movements as hostile, and the thought of even a dog offering hostility to Samuel J. Withers increased the banker's resentment. He did not like dogs anyhow. Useless and a nuisance. "Confound you!" he cried petulantly. "What do you mean? Get out of my way!" And then, to the everlasting shame of Samuel J. Withers, he pulled back a thin leg and let fly a thin foot, which struck Bill in the middle. "Get out!" said Samuel J. Withers again, raking Bill's ribs with another accurately directed kick. Bill did not yelp. The blows hurt him, but he had never given open manifestation of pain since he was a puppy. Besides, he did not fully appreciate the indignity which had been done him. No one had ever before raised a hand, much less a foot, against Bill in anger. The old dog moved slowly out of range of Samuel J. Withers' long, thin leg, eyeing the financier with a curious expression, but stepping with grave, gentle dignity, which, of course, Samuel J. Withers did not understand. Bill walked over to the crowd of spectators and sat down on his haunches. From that vantage he continued to gaze at Samuel J. Withers, as if fixing the man's face in his mind. Samuel J. Withers resumed his stroll, dimly conscious not only that his action had been a trifle small and undignified, but that it had created a most untoward stir among the group of onlookers. However, he impatiently dismissed the matter from his mind and turned to the contemplation of more serious affairs. The things were not going altogether well with Samuel J. Withers at his bank. He, one of the leading financiers of the state, had been using ever larger sums of the depositors' money for his own purposes, investing heavily in enterprises that were not prospering. The two he soon dismissed, because Samuel J. Withers had been confronted by similar situations in the years that had gone before, and he had triumphed over difficulties. He crackled his thin lips in a smile as he saw a party of prominent citizens of Quinby bearing down upon him with words welcome. Homer Handybow was out of town on business, and it was agreed that the indignity put upon Bill should not be mentioned to Homer if he returned before the departure of Samuel J. Withers. The railroad detective was a man of but indifferent poise, and the townspeople felt that as the financier was in a sense their guest, and his presence in Quinby an honour to the community, Homer's unrestrained might work an injury. Homer saved them the trouble of secrecy, however, by remaining away until Mr. Withers had concluded a brief foray into the fields, attended by various prominent citizens and his own private secretary. "I suppose you'd call that a good day's work," said Samuel J. Withers without enthusiasm as he sat in the observation end of his car that night with his secretary surrounded by the local citizens. "I told my friends in Topeka I'd have some game for them when I go back. By the way, Kerwin," he called to the secretary, "those game bags are too small. You better empty out that old black leather grip of mine, and we'll take it with us tomorrow to carry the extra shells and bring home the dead." 2 days of slaughter satiated the financier, and when his car returned to Topeka, his own hands carried the black bag crammed with game to his bank, where he distributed the dead birds among the more favoured clerks with the air of a man bestowing great favours. He tossed the bag into a corner of one of the vaults, where it was soon forgotten. Old Bill held himself aloof from the station platform until after the special car had been removed. He moped at home or in the seclusion of sunny alleyways, and he greeted even old friends with suspicion. Manifestly, his faith in human nature had been sorely tried. When Handybow returned and was informed of what had occurred during his absence, he was extremely angry, because Homer loved Bill best of all the things in this world. His shotgun ranking second, perhaps, and the son of Lord Brazen a poor third. He sat down and wrote a letter to the president of the Metallic Bank, whom he'd never seen. He never told what he said in this epistle, and Samuel J. Withers did not divulge its contents, but it must have been a sparkling effort for a man of no great education, because shortly afterwards Samuel J. Withers casually dropped in on his friend Herman Reichner, head of the Secret Service of the Santa Fe, and shortly after that Herman Reichner asked Homer Handybone for his resignation. The detective guessed the cause, but he did not care. He had had his say. The hunting field has a worldwide Freemasonry. Homer Handybow recalled that he knew the head of a private detective agency in New York with whom he had hunted. He applied to this man for a situation and was ordered to report in the big city as soon as possible. And when Handybow was confronted with the very serious problem of disposing of Bill, the son of Lord Brazen caused him no trouble, but none of Homer's close friends manifested any enthusiasm when the old dog's name was brought up. "I'll take him with me," said Homer finally. "He ain't got long to live. He's been a good pal to me. There must be places around New York where he can sort of hang out and get his sunshine, and I'll know where he is. If I left him here, I'd be worried, sure." And so they went, Bill in the baggage car, marvelling greatly but satisfied by frequent visits from Homer that all was well. Life in the big city was a lonely experience for Bill. Homer found a quiet boarding house on East 29th Street. The landlady was a fat German woman who agreed to attend carefully to Bill's wants, and who meant to do so. But her idea of attention began and ended with a daily rasher of food scraps. Handybow had to be away a great deal of the time, and naturally he could not take the dog with him. Mrs. Schultz, the landlady, fixed a place for Bill down in the basement near the coal bins and the storerooms. Big, vicious alley cats infested that domain and made life a burden for the poor old hunting dog, who had been taught early in life not to bother cats. He had been on friendly terms with all the felines in Quinby, But when he endeavoured to establish an amicable relations with these neighbours of the coal hole, he nearly lost his eyesight. So Handybow took Bill into his own room at night and endured Bill's stertorous breathing as best he could, although other roomers complained. During the day, Bill wandered listlessly along the block in front of the boarding house, following the patches of sunshine as they shifted from place to place on the sidewalk. He tried staying around the house, but the voice of Mrs. Schultz pelted him constantly with querulous exclamations, and that got on his nerves. He could not become accustomed to the roar and bustle of the streets. Twice he was rolled over by flying automobiles. In Quinby, when Bill crossed a street with slow and dignified tread, teamsters and horsemen pulled up and let him pass. Here in New York, no one had any consideration for an old dog. He missed the breath of the earth. His heart yearned for friendly faces. Meantime, Homer Handybow was also having his troubles. He was not getting along very rapidly with the detective agency. "I'll tell you what it is, Handy," said Dick Raymond, his employer. "You're a grand good fella and a good wing shot, but I'd be blamed if I believe you've got any talent for private detective work. You've fallen down and skinned your nose on 4 jobs in a row, which is rotten average. 3 would have been bad, but 4 is too many. I don't believe I'm going to be able to use you much longer. You've had a chance to hook a nice piece of reward money in 2 of those cases too. You'd better go back to spotting stolen freight cars in Kansas." And then a clerk came into the room and handed Raymond a card. "Show him in," said Raymond. "And here comes a pal of mine who's got a job with the State Game Warden's Department," he explained to Handybow. "I'll introduce you. He don't know any more about game than you do about getting divorce evidence, and maybe you can trade information. How are you, Bramble?" A short, rotund man wearing nose glasses and displaying an amazing discordant tie and waistcoat had suddenly bounced into the office. "Dick, I want you to lend me a good man," he said without preliminary. "I want a guy who knows something about game, birds and things, not baseball or 3-cushion billiards. My office is on my hip about raiding some of these swell joints that are dishing up game out of season, see? I don't know quail from turkey after they're both on toast, and I'll pay somebody that does, because I don't want the officer sending some hick out here on me to show me up." Raymond arose with alacrity and dragged Homer Handybow forward. "Bob Bramble, I want you to shake hands with Handybow, the best game grabber there what is. Handybow, Bramble. Get together and get out." "I ain't what you call a wise game warden," exclaimed the voluble Bramble as they walked down Broadway arm in arm. "Fact is, my job's rather political. I'm an automobile salesman by trade. All we got to do is nose around these Broadway hotels and take in the cafes on the avenue and see whether they're selling game out of season, which they are, because I was in a joint with Miss Blondine one night last week and got next 6 seeds for a rail bird or a reed bird or something. I can't tell venison from mutton except by the price. But we'll work on this together, and when you jerry me that you think there's game in the house, we'll pinch the icebox, see? I owe some of these swell snares a roust at that." As Handybow and Bramble were strolling down Broadway, Bill was sprawled on the sidewalk in front of the boarding house. A lonely, disconsolate old dog. He was thinner than when he arrived in New York. Life in the big town demands agility even of the aged. Bill was dozing fitfully, but he had learned to sleep with his senses at half-cock. Suddenly he raised his square muzzle from the inhospitable concrete and batted his dim and watery eyes at the figure of a man in the far distance. The man was moving away from Bill towards a region which, as the dog had learned from experience, was dangerous territory for him. He did not know, of course, that it was called Fifth Avenue. The man was roughly dressed. There was mud on his clothing. It was not the dress, however, which attracted the old dog's attention so much as a long, cylindrical object which the man bore over one shoulder, slanting upward and outward at an angle to his head. Bill was not close enough to inspect the man carefully, but something stirred at the old dog's heart, and he arose trembling to his feet. Well, he recalled the appearance of Homer Handybow on those frosty mornings of the long ago, when he would come shuffling out of the kitchen in similar rough attire, with just such an object over his shoulder, to whistle shrilly into the dim light of the dawn for Bill. Clearly, this man down the street was going hunting. Clearly, he needed a dog, for there was none with him. Bill started after him as rapidly as the old dog's feeble legs would permit, doddering along with a queer side-to-side movement, his tail wagging eagerly and his nose in the air. Bill never learned that the man was an Italian labourer with a section of gas pipe over his shoulder. The old dog hurried across 4th Avenue, then across Madison, the man always some distance in front. At 5th Avenue, the Italian walked through a lane of horses and snorting autos, held in leash on either side like greyhounds in the slips by the uplifted hand of a traffic policeman. Just as Bill reached the corner, the hand came down, the two lines rushed together, and the lane was obliterated. Bill waited with unconcealed impatience, and the passers eyeing him with amusement. When the policeman again opened a new lane, the Italian had disappeared. Bill hastened across the avenue, gazing excitedly about him and snuffling the air. He was too anxious and eager to be disturbed by the clamour about him or by people brushing against him. The aged dog whined audibly and swung his inquiring nose into the breeze that fanned softly up the avenue. Aha! Far down the street he saw the feathery spray of green trees, tossing lightly in a dark channel of buildings. That was undoubtedly the hunting field. He would find his man there. Bill could not appreciate the fact that he'd merely discovered Madison Square. He set off eagerly down 5th Avenue, dodging pedestrians, ducking under the very noses of horses, and holding to a straight course regardless. Samuel J. Withers left a small hotel in 26th Street, turned into 5th Avenue, and directed his footsteps towards Madison Square. He bore a battered old black grip in one hand. He walked rapidly with many a furtive glance to the right and left. He was headed for the Hudson Tubes in 23rd Street, and ultimately for a steamer which was to sail for Europe that morning. He did not notice a liver and white pointer dog rolling unsteadily along in the swift stream of humanity. He did not notice that his black bag grazed the dog's head. Samuel J. Withers's mind could not absorb trifles at the moment. Then a curious thing occurred. Bill drew his head aside as the swinging bag brushed his ear. Suddenly he came to a full pause, raised his square muzzle in the air and sniffed. Down came the nose again to a dead level. The muscles of the dog's body became rigid. His tail stood out behind him as straight as a handle. He raised his right foreleg from the ground and held it doubled beneath him. His ears were slightly raised, and his nostrils quivered delicately with excitement. Old Bill had come to a full stand in the heart of the crowded way. Spectators paused in astonishment. Women timidly drew their children into nearby doorways. Men laughed. A dandified young fellow with a smear of moustache across his upper lip and a wide-brimmed derby slanted back from his forehead until the rim rested on his ears, started to poke Bill with a little pliant cane. Two carefully groomed old gentlemen with silver hair raised warning hands. The crowd stood back and watched Bill. "What a picture," said one of the old men. "Takes me back 30 years. "That old dog's gone bugs," commented a cocky little gold-braided door tender from a nearby jewelry store. Meanwhile, Samuel J. Withers moved on down the street, unconscious of the stir behind him. Soon Bill broke his pose and followed on, his body one straight line from his nose to the tip of his quivering tail. He seemed to slide stealthily along rather than walk. The crowd trailed him, picking up additions as it went. The carefully groomed old men headed the mob, talking excitedly. A few yards behind Samuel J. Withers, Old Bill came to a second stand. This time he rolled a questioning eye to his rear. He was waiting for the familiar crash of the gunshot and doubtless wondering what sort of an amateur was behind him. The spectators now numbered several hundred, and someone had suggested "mad dog," which brought a couple of policemen hurrying to the scene. One of the old men jerked an authoritative thumb at the officers, and they fell back with an apologetic, "All right, Inspector." Homer Handybow and the loquacious Bramble were standing at that corner of Flatiron Building, which acts as a breakwater for Broadway and Fifth Avenue, where the two streets roll together at Madison Square, and which splits the currents out again into their proper channels. Bramble and Handybow were debating the choice of a cafe for their first inspection when Samuel J. Withers moved diagonally across their line of vision, headed into 23rd Street. They saw an old pointer dog rush into view, crouching as he ran, and came to a stand in the middle of the street. For an instant the incongruity of the picture did not strike Homer Handybow. He had been talking about game and hunting for 2 hours solidly. There were trees and grass in the near distance. Unconsciously, Homer's arms and hands came to the position of ready, and his fingers groped for the trigger guard. Then he saw the amazed crowd draw up in an eager line behind the dog. It occurred to him afterwards that he also vaguely noted that the dog's general attitude was expressive of disgust. "Why, it's Old Bill," said Homer wonderingly. Intuition immediately shifted his eyes along the line of the dog's point, travelling straight from Bill's nose through a crowd of people milling along the sidewalk. Handybow's gaze picked out the thin figure of Samuel J. Withers. Then his eyes gathered in the black bag in Withers' hand. "Bramble, we got a game dealer right there," he said quickly. "That's my dog." And he pointed on the bag in the tall fellow's hand. "You bet there's game birds in that satchel, or Bill wouldn't be acting like an old idiot. Hi, Bill." Traffic had halted on either side of the dog, forming a deep ring around him, rimmed by the inquiring heads of drivers and chauffeurs. Handybow's cry was a welcome note to Bill. Here at last was a man who knew what to do. Bill tensed himself for the roar of the gun, but instead felt Handybow's fingers gripping his collar, and Handybow dragging him to the sidewalk. Bill did not understand, but he was content. He trusted his master. Meanwhile, Bob Bramble was scuttling importantly down the street in the wake of the tall, thin man, who was rapidly effacing himself in the dense crowds of 23rd Street. Police Captain O'Malley looked up with a sternly reproving expression as a large concourse of people came flocking turbulently into his office, headed by a short, stout, voluble man who was leading a tall, thin man by a thin arm. At the heels of the delegation crept an old liver and white dog who evaded the doorkeeper's rush with surprising agility. The animal seemed interested only in a black handbag carried by the short, stout man. Outside the door, a big crowd was gathering, talking wildly. The tall, thin man was protesting. "I charge this man with unlawfully and feloniously having in his possession," began Bramble grandly, but O'Malley cut him short. "Who are all these people, and what's the row?" he demanded of an officer who brought up the rear of the procession with deprecating tread. "They claim they got something in the bag the old dog sniffed out," said the officer ambiguously. "I can't make head or tail of it myself." "I'm a deputy game warden," declared Bramble pompously. "Open the satchel, that's all. The dog smelled 'em." Captain O'Malley grew purple in his face. Words struggled to his lips, but were choked with anger. And then a quiet voice reached in his ear. "Open the satchel, Captain," said one of the old men who had followed Bill down the avenue. "I think there's something to this, and the gentleman surely can't object. I'm curious myself." "I've got valuable papers in there," said Samuel J. Withers feebly. "I protest against this hard-handed outrage." But the captain had recognized the inspector. Placing the black bag on a table, he hastily occupied himself with the clasps. The spectators crowded around him craned their necks. Even Bill's muzzle could be seen thrust forward, the nostrils quivering and the old eyes fairly sparkling with interest. Unnoticed, Samuel J. Withers sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands. Amid a deep silence, Captain O'Malley pulled the throat of the bag asunder, and packages of green currency popped out. O'Malley looked at the money with bulging eyes. A low murmur ran over the crowd. Then the police captain glanced sharply at Samuel J. Withers and turned to his desk. Fumbling along some papers for a moment, he produced a yellow telegram which he handed to the thunderstruck inspector. The gentleman wonderingly adjusted a pair of nose glasses, cleared his throat, and read, "Topeka, Kansas. To all officers, arrest and hold Samuel J. Withers, formerly president of the Metallic Bank of this city. We want him for bank wrecking and will pay $5,000 reward for his apprehension anywhere within the United States. Withers probably has with him $200,000 in a bank cash, which he removed from the vaults of the night of his departure. He may still be carrying the money in a black leather hand grip, as he was seen leaving the bag with this bag when he picked up the money in the money vault and filled it with all the available currency when he found he would have had to flee. Even if he found discarded, this bag should furnish a clue as to his movements. It is of easy identification, as the interior will be found blood-stained, having once been used for carrying game. Withers is a man of—" There was an interruption. Bill forced his head through the circle about the reader, moved over to the table upon which stood the open bag, raised himself to his forepaws, and nosed the packages of money, snuffling vigorously. Slowly he dropped himself to the floor again and walked out of the room, manifestly disappointed and disgusted.